Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise this afternoon to speak with respect to Bill C-12 and to speak about the need that seniors on low income are facing across the country. Over the last 3 years, I've had so many opportunities to speak with hundreds of seniors across Kitchener. Because often I was knocking on doors in the daytime. And who's home in the daytime? Seniors. And so I would joke, it's often the seniors I got to speak with most. And when we had those conversations, I'd ask them about, what's most important to them. I would hear their stories. Their stories about the cost of rent going up, the cost of groceries, transit, in fact, the cost of everything. And the reality that the cost of living for seniors is going up so much faster than the guaranteed income supplement or old age security is. And in those conversations, I would hear their anxiety, I'd sometimes hear their anger, and I promised them that as their MP, I'd be advocating for their interests in this place. We have to recognize that even at the maximum amount, a single senior who's eligible for both GIS and OAS, the total amount is just over $1,600 a month. And would encourage other parliamentarians to reflect on, financial planners who might advise spend 30% of your income on housing and to start doing the math on what it looks like for a senior on low income living on GIS and OAS. Which brings me to what I appreciate about this bill. Because to me in this bill, what the governing party is doing is admitting a mistake was made. That we never should have had any clawbacks whatsoever to the lowest income seniors across the country. That's just not right, and that with this legislation, that's being addressed. I also really appreciate from both the Bloc and the NDP, and in particular, the member for North Island Powell River and Elmwood Transcona, for their advocacy to ensure that these funds are provided as soon as possible, recognizing the situation that low-income seniors are in Kitchener and across the country as a result of these clawbacks that were made, and recognizing that this legislation only really addresses going forward that this mistake doesn't happen again. So the fact that we're both addressing it not happening again and that there's a retroactive reimbursement being applied in the last fiscal update, I think is really important. I think it's also important for us to step back and notice when there is wild agreement in this place. Certainly that wasn't the case in question period. In fact, it's usually not the case in question period. But it was, in fact, all day. I've heard different parliamentarians tripping over themselves to share how much they are advocating for low-income seniors in their community, which is quite rare in this place. It doesn't matter which party I've heard a parliamentarian representing across every region and part of the country. This to me is encouraging, and it gives me a sense that it's possible when there is obvious good policy in front of people here that we should move ahead and get it done. I'd like to also share where I think we could be going further and faster. First is with respect to the funds flowing, and had some really wonderful line of questioning, in particular from the MP for de Salaberry-sur-Suriot. And understanding better in committee yesterday the fact that the reason that funds aren't flowing for all low-income seniors until April 19th is because we haven't been investing in the computer systems that our public service relies on to deliver these funds. And I can appreciate that it might not always be the most politically attractive to be investing in IT. But I also feel that this is an opportunity for us to look at and recognize that this is how seniors' lives are being affected when those there's not a fancy ribbon cutting. But when those investments aren't being made, it's directly affecting the lives of seniors across the country. And it's not for a lack, or my understanding at least, it is not for a lack of interest from the governing party in flowing money sooner, along with the advocacy from others across the floor, but rather because we haven't invested in the IT that we should have invested in years ago. And so I'd encourage all parliamentarians to consider supporting that our public service is able to follow through on these important investments. Secondly, I want to also call out how important it is that we actually have a private member's bill in support of a guaranteed livable income for all. And while, I wish it was a government bill, the fact that we have C-223 that's being put forward by the member for Winnipeg Centre gives us an opportunity to have a larger conversation, recognizing that even for a senior who won't have GIS and OAS clawed back, they're still living in poverty in most regions across the country. And that we should be doing so much more to ensure that every senior in the country is at a dignified level of income. That these are the folks who've been building the economy, and these are our elders. And with a guaranteed livable income, we wouldn't even be having this conversation we're in the midst of now. And so I'd encourage other parliamentarians to consider their support for that private member's bill and their support for moving towards a guaranteed livable income across the country. Also want to point out the need for us to make more progress on housing. So we can't talk about seniors on low income and the importance of getting to address the clawbacks if we're not going to be honest that it's housing that's climbing the fastest, which at least is something else that I've heard parliamentarians from every party talk about. And maybe there might be different solutions that are being offered, but at least that's another place for us to start to have good conversation, respectful conversation. In Kitchener, it's a 35% increase in the cost of housing and rent. And so I think about seniors in Kitchener who aren't just seeing the cost of housing go up, they're seeing a lack of access to dignified housing and also the proximity of that housing to the amenities that they need the most, to transit stations that they need to access. And so we need to move forward far more quickly when it comes to addressing the rising cost of housing, which both means addressing the supply as well as the policies to ensure that homes are for people, seniors to live in, and not commodities for investors to trade. And the last thing I'll mention in closing is the importance for us also to be addressing long-term care. And while not the main focus of this piece of legislation, if we're going to be talking about the need to be taking better care of our seniors, we all have recognized the gaps in long-term care, and that there's the opportunity for the federal government to step in to improve the standards in long-term care, to address the wait times, to address the pay for personal support workers. And so in closing, I'd encourage all parliamentarians to continue to support this important bill, to get this done, but not to stop here, to ensure that we move forward quicker when it comes to the cost of housing, to a guaranteed income, and to ensuring that these reimbursements are provided at the earliest opportunity. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The young member for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and for the opportunity to thank my colleague for his speech from the Green Party. And I think, as he mentioned in his comments today, there's been support for this legislation in going through. I think there's been some issues of process have been the challenge of making sure that Parliament has the appropriate time to discuss and debate exactly what he spoke about today. This is right to fix a problem that should have actually fixed a very long time ago. I think of my constituency office, and we saw some of these programs announced at the beginning of the pandemic and how they were red flags raised then, and here we are now 2 years later correcting a problem, and the government saying we need to do this right away. I agree with the member completely that housing for seniors, rent is a big issue, the cost of living is, and having the proper time for these bills to go over and discuss issues that seniors face in general is something we need to do. So I wonder if you can maybe comment on the process and why we need to rush these things all the time as opposed to having debates on the substantive issues people in Kitchener and the country are facing.
Kitchener Centre.
Yeah, I appreciate the question on process, and I've heard the concerns raised by members across the way with respect to the speed of the passage. I would agree, I would have liked to have had more time. However, recognizing that there are other priorities to continue to move towards, recognizing the bill in this case is literally on one page. In my view, this is an example where it may not be ideal, but my interest is ensuring that seniors get as much support as quickly as possible has my interest in continuing to move ahead. Thank you.
Commentaire, l'honorable député Longueuil.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. Now, he touched on the topic of housing. And we know that when it comes to poverty among seniors, well, you have to discuss the topic of housing. And in my riding, it's a very difficult situation. There are 2,000 people on wait lists to go into social housing. And I recall discussing a certain program with my colleague on Zoom. It's a program to create social housing, but unfortunately it's underfunded. There's only $1 billion in the program for $4 billion worth of projects. So does my colleague not feel, like me, that federal government funding for affordable housing is ending up going for $2,000 a month apartments in Montreal? It's not really the right stuff. Doesn't my colleague think that more money should be invested?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
For the conversations we've had and for his shared advocacy that we need far more significant investment in a mix of community, public, co-op housing across the country. And that we know that in the past this has been done. You know, back in the early 80s, that was the case. I believe it was around 8% of new rental units constructed, for example, were co-op housing, whereas now we're down to less than 1%. And so we know we have the example of when the federal government stepped up at the pace and the scale required. And I look forward to working with the member and others in this House to move back towards a scale and a pace as we've had in the past.
Questions and comments? Brief question, the honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the member for his speech and for sharing our desire to quickly address the mistake that the government made. The government knew about this back in May of 2021, and seniors have suffered because of the delay, but also for his comments about how seniors need supports more broadly and the support for the member from Winnipeg Centre's bill on guaranteed basic income. Seniors are living in poverty. Could the member speak to what a guaranteed basic income would mean for the residents in his riding?
A brief answer from the member for Kitchener Centre.
It means they wouldn't be waiting the amount of time they have been to get to this legislation. It means that it wouldn't be piecemeal. It means that they would know that this government truly does have their back as it would for every other Canadian across the country. And it's why I think we need to rally around not only this private member's bill, but any effort in this place to ensure that every Canadian, seniors included, have access to a dignified life. Thank you.